Hello YouTube, welcome back. You guys are in for an interesting video today, let me tell you, because I am going to be pleasuring each and every one of you with some fiery hot takes. Spicy hot, controversial even. And this video is going to be very, very nerdy. This is the nerdiest video I've ever made, and ever will make for that matter, because I am completely drained after making this video. I feel as exhausted as I was in high school when I had to write all those 200-word essays. Or do I still have nightmares about those? But despite that, I think it's important for a video like this to be made, and I think it will really help people. So just sit back, relax, drink a sody pop, and just listen to me rant for the next hour or so. I promise that if you pay attention throughout this video, you will learn a lot of things, a lot of stuff about this game. In fact, I'll be talking about things that you probably haven't even thought of before. Funnily enough, after my last ranting video, I didn't think I had anything else to rant about. But things have changed. My eyes have been opened to all of the atrocities that are being committed in the world of Warcraft. So now I have something to rant about. Class discords are the topic of today. Specifically, healer class discords for Classic. Even more specifically, the priest healing class discord, since that seems to be the most egregious one. Although they are all kind of similar in their beliefs about things and the information that they tend to spread around to the masses. So even though I'll be spending this entire video talking about the priest class discord, the stuff that I'm saying will partially apply to the other healer class discords as well. And to be real with you, I never thought I'd end up making a video like this, because I don't really want to give these people any attention, but unfortunately there are a lot of players who go to the class discords for advice. I also think the Wowhead guides are loosely based on what the class discord people are saying, even if specific details are not correct. And that's a problem, because I do believe that these healer class discords do a disservice to the community a lot of the time, but especially the priest class discord. So that's why I felt the need to make this video. Keep in mind that there are some things that the class discords are good at, mainly the basic shit, like what talents you should take, how you should gear, your stat priority, and stuff like that. But when it comes to actually learning how to be a good healer, the class discords are not the place to go for that, in my opinion. And that is what I'm going to try and prove to you throughout this video. So here's how this is going to go. I'm going to be talking about two things. The first thing I'm going to talk about is all of the issues that the healer class discords have, and basically any other platform where random people can discuss World of Warcraft. So platforms like Reddit, the Battle.net forums, the MMO Champion forums, they're all kind of similar. And after that, I'm going to be giving my thoughts on maximizing healing versus maximizing DPS as a disc priest, which is something that is heavily discussed on the priest class discord. Although I use the word discussed here loosely, as I don't believe that any positive discussions about this topic can actually be had on the priest class discord, but I'll get more into that later. And keep in mind that even if you don't play disc priest, this section of the video will still be relevant to you, as I will be going over why maximizing your healing in general is important, not just for disc priest. Lastly, I want to say that if you disagree with anything that I say in this video, feel free to leave a comment below telling me what you disagree with. I try to respond to everyone who disagrees with me in the comment section, unless I feel like you're just shitposting or being disingenuous or saying a whole bunch of random irrelevant shit to try and waste my time. As long as you don't do that, I'll respond to you. So to start, I'm going to talk about my own experiences with the forums that discuss World of Warcraft, and then I'll move on to the class discord since I feel like they're related. So I started reading the Battle.net forums back in 2010. After spending a couple years on there, I moved over to the MMO Champion forums and spent most of my time on there instead. And I read these forums every day, mostly because I was bored, but also because I was heavily addicted to WoW at the time, so obviously the discussions on there were relevant to me, and I was interested in them. Again, I use the word discussions loosely, because I realized as I got older that the kinds of people who talk on these forums aren't really interested in having actual discussions about anything. Instead, they would rather spend all their time flaming people who have different opinions than them and painting them out to be the bad guy, rather than actually engaging with what they're saying and challenging their own understanding of things. Now, this is probably true for every internet forum that has ever existed ever. And in a sense, there is a kind of lighthearted comedic nature to all the flaming and shitposting that goes on the forums. It's fun to read, and if you're not the one getting flamed, you'll probably find yourself rather entertained when everything's said and done. I found it pretty entertaining at the time. But after a while, it kind of got boring for me. I found myself wanting a platform where people could have somewhat intelligent discussions about the game, but it didn't seem like that existed at the time. So I ended up just really hating the kinds of people that talked on these forums, and I eventually stopped spending my time there. Now in Wrath Classic, I was introduced to class discords. I had no idea what they were. I'd only heard of them briefly at that point, so I decided to take a look. And unfortunately, what I found was a bunch of people who acted and talked exactly like the people that I hated from the WoW forums. But unfortunately, that wasn't the only problem. These class discords have another problem that makes everything so much worse. And that problem is moderators. Now, back then, I wasn't unfamiliar with what happens when you give moderators power to do things, because I've been watching streamers on Twitch pretty much every day since 2012. And my experiences on Twitch have made me come to the conclusion that all moderators on the internet are worthless subhuman pieces of libcuck trash, which is an opinion that has only been further cemented into my mind as time has gone on. Now, with that said, moderators do exist on the Battle.net forums and the MMO Champion forums, but they don't really have that much power. They're kind of like ghosts, actually. You pretty much never see them. However, on the class discords, moderators have a lot more power. They have the power to prevent people from talking about things that they disagree with. Moderators have the power to make people look bad for disagreeing with them. In fact, everyone in the Discord has that power. And what you end up with when you have a system like this is an echo chamber. The moderators are the ones who establish the echo chamber, and then below them you have the cronies who essentially just parrot everything that the moderators believe in. And anyone who disagrees with those people gets absolutely shit on. They get targeted, made an example of, and flamed out of the Discord. Let me show you what I mean. In this screenshot, we've got a bunch of people talking about maximizing healing versus maximizing DPS as a disc priest, which is completely fine and is definitely something worth talking about, except it's clear to me that not everybody in this conversation is on an equal playing field. The priest Discord has this system where everyone who disagrees with the moderators gets trogged, and if you hover over it, it says interact at your own risk. Once that person has been trogged, then you have the cronies who do their part and spam clown emotes under every comment that person posts. Obviously, the purpose of all this is to try and push that person to leave the Discord so that the echo chamber can be maintained. The priest Discord also has a thread called Hell, which apparently was created by the moderator to prevent people from talking about healing parses, because he personally doesn't think that they matter, so therefore in his mind, nobody should be allowed to talk about them. It seems to me like this moderator believes he's some sort of bastion of truth and knowledge, despite just being some rando on the internet like the rest of us. What gives him the right to control what people are allowed to talk about? Who knows? Fortunately, he made a post explaining himself, which is good, because I would hope that he has a real good argument for preventing people from talking about healing parses, or else it wouldn't really make any sense for him to do it, since healing parses are relevant to the topic of healing in general, so I don't see why you wouldn't be allowed to talk about them. But you know what? If this guy truly is the all-knowing, all-powerful God of healing that he believes himself to be, raining down from the heavens to bless all of us with his knowledge about healing parses, and to inform us what we should and shouldn't be allowed to talk about, if that's who he is, then this post that he wrote should be completely foolproof and have no counter arguments. Well, let's see if it is. Here's his first point. Healing is a mutual effort, and caring about HPS parses typically results in the person playing as if they are competing against the other healers. Well, he's off to a bad start, because while healing is a mutual effort, raiding in general is a mutual effort. DPSing is a mutual effort. DPSers are literally working together to kill a boss as fast as possible. That's a mutual effort. You can't do it by yourself. So what is even the point of mentioning that healing is a mutual effort? It doesn't prove anything. Next, he mentions healers competing against each other, which doesn't actually mean anything either unless you explain why competing against each other is a bad thing. He didn't say that part. He just implied that competing with your co-healers is bad without actually explaining why it's bad. So this whole sentence is just empty words that mean nothing. Here's his next point. The optimal way to play an encounter typically isn't the one that will result in the highest HPS. For example, cleansing diseases and curses, avoiding unnecessary damage, or avoiding mechanics by having good raid DPS. Now, I don't know what avoiding mechanics by having good raid DPS is supposed to mean. If he's talking about killing bosses so fast that you skip entire mechanics, that shit doesn't even happen until the boss is heavily on farm, so I don't really see the point in mentioning that. But regardless, this entire statement isn't wrong, but it is very misleading. Technically, it's true that the most optimal way to heal a boss won't result in the highest possible HPS, but be careful, because the statement might trick you into believing that the amount of healing you do doesn't matter, which is not true. Because here's the thing. The optimal way to play an encounter typically is the one that results in really high HPS. It might not be the highest possible HPS, but it's enough HPS to where you can parse really, really well. And this is one of the things that I absolutely hate about the way people discuss things on the class discords. People talk about things as if they are entirely black and white, meaning that healing parses either 100% matter or they 0% matter, and there's no in between. Except that is not reality. When he says the optimal way to heal the boss won't result in the highest HPS, he intentionally worded his statement like that to make you believe that healing parses 0% matter. Every other statement in his post is also worded the same way, but in reality, this argument only makes healing parses slightly less legitimate. Very, very slightly. Now, if the optimal way to heal most boss fights was to parse in the 50 percentile range, then he would actually have a solid argument against healing parses. But since the difference between doing the highest possible HPS and really high HPS is razor thin, this argument is not strong, and it does not delegitimize healing parses. On top of that, he mentions cleansing and dispels, except most bosses don't even require you to cleanse and dispel. And most of the bosses that do require it have very little cleansing and dispelling going on, to the point where spending a few globals here and there on cleansing and dispelling really isn't going to affect your healing very much. And this is especially true as the expansions go on. In vanilla WoW, there was a lot of cleansing and dispelling to do, but in Wrath, Kata, and Mob, there really isn't that much. Blizzard has also designed bosses to do more damage as time has gone on, because it seems like they realized at some point that giving healers damage to heal is a good thing. So the amount of healing that you do has become more important throughout the expansions, which means healing parses have also become more important. At least until you get to the expansions where they ruin healer gameplay completely, like in WoD, Legion, and BFA. Actual dogshit company. Next, he talks about avoiding unnecessary damage. Here's the problem with that. Most guilds in the world take loads of unnecessary damage. Taking unnecessary damage is inevitable, and the best healers are the ones who can heal through as much of it as possible. People like to believe that healers who parse well are just telling everyone to take more damage so that they can parse, except that only ever happens on bosses that are really easy and do no damage. Most of the time, the healers that parse well are just doing a good job healing, and sometimes people mess up mechanics. I mess up mechanics all the time. But if you can heal through it, then you can parse really well. And if you can't heal through it, then you're going to have to wipe over and over until people stop taking unnecessary damage. If you really think about it, there aren't that many mechanics that instantly kill you 100 to 0 when you mess them up. A lot of the time, people are getting nicked by certain things, like maybe they'll take a hit of Lightning Conductor on Omnitron, and then they take damage from something else shortly after and they die. Sometimes, many people get hit by Lightning Conductor at the same time, or maybe they stand too close to each other on Ascendant Council Phase 3, or maybe everyone's getting shit on by Fabulous Flames and Engulfing Magic on Valiona. This stuff happens all the time, and the best healers are the ones that can not only heal through that, but they can do so as efficiently as possible so that they don't go before the fight is over. And that's why this statement doesn't make any sense. If you say shit like, you can't do good healing if nobody takes unnecessary damage, who are you even talking about? Because the only guilds that avoid unnecessary damage really well are like the top 1% of guilds in the world. Probably less than that. Do you want to make the argument that healing parses are irrelevant because healers in top guilds can't parse since they don't take enough unnecessary damage? Because that's a good argument for why healing parses do matter, because they're way more competitive. You're not able to just get all the top parses for free by being in a top guild, which is how it works for DPS parses. Also, I'm not even convinced that healers in top guilds can't parse. If your guild is so fucking good at avoiding unnecessary damage, then you can drop healers aggressively and parse anyways. So this whole statement is just stupid. Last point. Healers are extremely dependent on your comp. You won't parse well with too many healers, which often still is a reasonable amount. And you won't parse if you bring healers with the same niche. Think 2 times TBC Circle of Healing Holy Priest, or 2 times Wrath Holy Pally Disc Priest. Okay, so the mistake he made here is he shouldn't have said you won't parse well, because you can absolutely parse well if you overheal content and if you bring healers with the same niche. Back in TBC, I 6-healed SSC with a quadruple Rusted Druid comp, and I was still able to parse well on the bosses that did damage. So saying that you won't parse well is just wrong. What he should have said is you are less likely, or it is more difficult to parse well. But even if that's true, even if you are less likely to parse well relative to other guilds because of your comp, your parse is still a reflection of how good you are relative to the other healers in your guild. When you look at these logs, does it not suggest that I'm the best healer in the raid? That is the point of logs, isn't it? To see who's the best? It looks like these logs are doing a pretty good job at showing that. And this is why I absolutely hate it when people on the class discords and Reddit and whatever else constantly go on and on about healing parses being a meme or being completely irrelevant. First off, it's not even true for every expansion and for every class. But even in the expansions where healing parses are totally fried, like in Vanilla or Wrath or Mop, you should still try to improve your healing week on week. Even if you can't get 99s in those expansions because they're all cheesed, that doesn't mean the healing you do doesn't matter. And if people in the community are constantly saying over and over that healing parses are a meme, how do you think players looking for advice are going to interpret that? Do you think they're going to tell themselves, well, my parses can't really be compared to the top parses in the world because they're all cheesed, but I should still try to improve my parses week on week? Is that what they're going to tell themselves? Or are they going to tell themselves, well, I guess the amount of healing I do doesn't matter? Obviously, that's what they're going to actually tell themselves. And that is really fucking bad. Nobody should ever tell themselves that. But they do. And it's because the community is relentlessly putting that idea into their heads. Now I'm going to talk about overhealing bosses a little bit before I move on, because I feel like most healers are coping extremely hard about this. I'm going to be brutally honest with you. Guilds that find themselves constantly bringing extra healers to bosses week on week are typically the ones that have bad healers. Because if they didn't have bad healers, they wouldn't feel the need to constantly overheal bosses. So this whole argument that you can't parse well because your guild always overheals bosses is completely overblown by the community. Everyone who complains that they can't parse as a healer because they're constantly overhealing bosses is either extremely unlucky or they're not nearly as good at the game as they think they are, and they wouldn't even be able to parse well if their guild did drop healers. I have played in a bunch of guilds that have overhealed bosses at one point or another, but the guild leaders all realize very quickly that it's not necessary. If your guild leader isn't coming to that realization eventually, then it's probably because it is necessary for your guild to overheal bosses. I'll be talking more about that in the next section of this video, but moving back to his comment here, what he says about healing parses is true. Healing parses are extremely dependent on your comp. But the further you look into that statement, the more you realize that a lot of it is cope, and it doesn't prove that healing parses don't matter. If you're genuinely a good healer, not only will you be able to parse well with a shitty comp, but you're less likely to end up overhealing bosses and healing with a shitty comp in the first place. On another note, the wording at the top of his post about not allowing people to talk about cheesing parses is fine, in my opinion. As far as I know, there's never anything good that can come from cheesing your parses, but preventing people from talking about improving their parses normally without cheesing, that's ridiculous. So for him to say down here that improving your healing parses doesn't make you a good healer and caring about good parses makes you look stupid. You know what actually makes you look stupid? Writing a post like this. It might not make you look stupid to the people on the class Discord who blindly suck you off and believe everything you say, but it makes you look stupid to me. Because what you're actually saying with this post is, I want to believe what I want to believe, and everyone who disagrees with me should be silenced. That's what you're actually saying. But here's the thing. Just because you've managed to turn this Discord server into an echo chamber doesn't mean you're correct. Anyways, the reason I say all this is not because I want this video to be about healing parses. I've already talked about healing parses in my State of Healing Akata video, so you can watch that if you want. What I'm actually trying to show you is that there are counter arguments to everything this guy says. But you would never know that if you were to come to this class Discord looking for advice, because this Discord is set up to be an echo chamber. The kinds of people who spend all day on these class Discords talking and giving advice to people, they don't care about being right. They just want to suck each other off in their echo chamber all day long and get rid of anyone who disagrees with them. Doesn't sound like a good place to go if you're looking for advice on how to play the game, does it? In my mind, a healer class Discord should be a place where random people can go talk about anything relevant to healing. And there shouldn't be any emotes or thumbs up or anything like that. And the moderator's job should just be to sit in the background and get rid of people who are being overly toxic or getting off topic. That's it. That's all the moderator should do. That's how I remember the moderators being on the Battle.net forums and the MMO Champion forums, and I thought it worked pretty well. Now, that's not to say that the end result would be really good discussions about healing all the time, because that would not be the end result. Even without all the stupid emotes and the moderator abuse of power, the class Discord would still be a bunch of people shitposting and saying a whole bunch of dumb, incorrect shit all the time, because that's just the nature of any online forum where random people can come in and talk. But at the very least, you'd be allowed to talk about whatever you want. Anyways, let's move on to the second part of the video and start talking about maximizing healing versus maximizing DPS as a disc priest, because this is where I believe the class Discord is doing a big disservice to people. So first, I'm going to talk about how I play healers in this game. I'm going to give you my own thoughts on maximizing healing versus maximizing DPS as a disc priest, and after that, I'll respond to what the class Discord people are saying about it. So the way that I have always played healers in this game is I will maximize my healing as much as possible, except for in emergency situations or when dispelling is necessary. If someone is about to die or I predict that they're going to drop to low health, then I will try my best to keep that person alive, and then once they're no longer in danger of dying, I'll go back to maximizing my healing. The only situation where I will not do this is if I'm on a boss like Ascendant Council, where everyone is taking a shit ton of damage at the same time in phase 3. In phases like this, I think it's better to only use high HPS spells like Prayer of Healing, Prayer of Mending, and Powered Shield, instead of trying to save someone's life with a low HPS spell like Flash Heal or Penance, because by doing so, you will fall behind on the raid damage sooner, which means everyone will die sooner. This is how I've always healed, and it's the most fun way of playing a healer in my opinion, but is it the most optimal way to play a healer? And more specifically, is it the most optimal way of playing Disc Priest? Well, I believe for the vast majority of players, it is. And I've read through a lot of class Discord comments that are arguing against maximizing your healing, and I've noticed that most of their arguments seem to include one major misunderstanding about the game. And that misunderstanding is that they seem to believe that the optimal way to play healers is consistent across all levels of play. More specifically, the way that healers play in top guilds and in the speedrunning guilds is exactly how healers should play in semi-hardcore guilds and casual guilds. However, this is not true. And as I go about responding to the things that people are saying on the class Discord, I want you to keep this statement in mind. In fact, I'm going to throw it up in the top left corner for the rest of the video, because this seems to be the biggest point of contention between the way that I play the game and the way that the class Discord people believe is the optimal way for everyone to play the game. And what that means is, if anyone can convince me that this statement in the top left is true, then you will have completely shit on my way of playing the game. Every guide that I've made since TBC telling people how to heal would be completely wrong if you are able to prove this statement to be true. And what I will be doing is I'll be trying to prove to you that this statement is not true. And if I'm able to do that, it would mean that most of the advice the class Discord people have been spouting over and over, that maximizing your healing doesn't matter, that healing parses are irrelevant, that Disc Priest and Kata should contribute by doing damage as much as possible, all of that will be bullshit if I can prove this statement to be incorrect. So let's take a look at what the class Discord people are saying. I'm just going to pick out some things that I disagree with. So here's the first one. The only healing that matters is healing that prevents someone from dying. The only point of HP that matters is the last one. Healing that would have been soaked up by the other healers doing what they were going to do anyways is worthless. Okay, so let's talk about this first part here. The problem with this statement is that most of the time you aren't going to know for sure when people are going to die. Sometimes someone will be close to death, but they'll pop a cooldown, or another healer will heal them and they'll survive. Sometimes they won't pop a cooldown, and sometimes another healer won't heal them and they'll die. Sometimes a bunch of unavoidable damage will happen, like Sinestra's Fire Breath, or Magma's Lava Spew, or Omnitron's Incineration Security Measure, and you're thinking to yourself that everyone will be okay, because none of those abilities do enough damage to kill you. But then, certain players might make a mistake. A lot of times, a bunch of players make mistakes at the same time. Maybe they'll get nicked by something like the fire on the ground on Magma, or by the purple orbs on Sinestra, or by Lightning Conductor on Omnitron, and they'll die. Sometimes the opposite happens, where they get nicked by something before the unavoidable raid damage happens, and they die to the unavoidable raid damage. This happens all the time, and the worse your guild is, the more likely people are going to take unnecessary damage, which will make you even more unsure when people are going to die. A common response that a class Discord person would have to this is, sounds like a skill issue. Of course it's a skill issue. The majority of players in this game have a skill issue. As a healer, you need to account for that, because the more skill issues you can heal through, the easier it'll be to kill raid bosses during progress and during farm. And this is where I'm going to tell you that the statement in the top left corner is wrong, because with this logic, the worse your guild is, the more beneficial it will be to maximize your healing versus maximizing your damage, because maximizing your healing is safer. The faster the health bars go up, the less likely people will die to overlapping mechanics. So when he says the only healing that matters is healing that prevents someone from dying, well, since you're not going to know for sure if or when people are going to die, especially if your guild isn't top tier, the optimal thing to do in most cases is to maximize your healing. Next, he says the only point of HP that matters is the last one, which is just a stupid thing to say. Like, what's he trying to tell us with this statement? That you should only start healing when the incoming damage will deplete someone's final health point? Yeah, good luck figuring out when that's going to be. Then he says healing that would have been soaked up by the other healers doing what they were going to do anyways is worthless. It's not worthless. That statement is wrong for the same reason that the previous statements were wrong. You are not going to know for sure if people are going to do the mechanics correctly, so it's better to just be safe and maximize your healing most of the time. Also, what's worth mentioning, the issue of having bad healers. What bad healers are going to do is heal up the damage much slower and less efficiently than good healers, because bad healers do everything wrong. They're bad at predicting incoming damage and slow at healing it up. They heal the wrong people. They manage their mana poorly. They spend a lot of time just kind of running around doing nothing. They overheal like crazy. And the end result of all that is your raid is going to be in danger of dying for longer periods of time, which means that relying on your co-healers, which is what he's suggesting that you do, is straight up a bad idea unless you're in a top guild where all of your co-healers are good. Again, further cementing that the comment in the top left is incorrect. Here's the next comment. I play with a lot of bad players. 99.9% of raids with bad players are overhealed. Like 6 healers for most fights, where a skilled raid would only need 4 healers. You know what these raids absolutely don't need? POH spam, which will just be 80 to 90% overhealing and is untargeted. Okay, I'm going to respond to that section first. What he says here is contradictory. He says 99.9% of raids with bad players are overhealed, which is probably true, but then he says those guilds with bad players don't need POH spam. That's a contradiction, because like I said before, the reason guilds tend to overheal bosses in the first place is because their healers aren't doing enough healing. If they were doing enough healing, they wouldn't have felt the need to add an extra healer in the first place. So those guilds that bring 6 healers do need the POH spam. Also, the next point about overhealing is bullshit. If anyone is overhealing by 80% or more with Prayer of Healing, they're autistic as fuck. I don't know why he said that. If there's nothing to heal, people aren't just going to continue spamming heals, they're going to sit on their mana and save it for the next round of damage. But anyways, that's not the main argument I have for this section here. I want to inform everyone about a very important element that goes into overhealing raid bosses that I've never seen anybody talk about. There's like this hidden detail looming in the background, and it seems like nobody wants to acknowledge or admit that it's even there. But I'll tell you what it is. If you want to heal raid bosses with a normal amount of healers, or perhaps even underheal one day, you have to prove to your guild leader that you can handle it. You are not going to prove a goddamn thing if you spam Atonement for the whole fight, because your healing is going to be shit. And let me tell you something. If your guild leader looks at the logs and he sees every healer parsing 50s, he's not going to think to drop healers. He's going to say to himself, well, it looks like every healer is contributing, so we'll have to continue 6 healing. That's what he's going to say. Now, I want you to look at our magma logs here. This is our second kill. I'm not going to show you our first kill because I got overkilled by 20 damage and it triggers me heavily. But here's our second kill. Now notice that even though we're 6 healing the boss, not all healers are contributing equally to this kill. The 2 Wrestle Shamans parsed gray. One of them is an Ellie Shaman main, so he's off the hook. But the point is, when a raid leader looks at this log, he's going to be thinking, maybe we don't need that second Wrestle Shaman. It looks like the other healers can handle the damage. If everyone was parsing around the same, the raid leader would not think that. And remember, dropping a healer is way more of a DPS increase for the raid than having a Disc Priest spam damage for the whole fight. Now look at our third kill of Magma. Sure enough, the raid leader decides to drop the second Wrestle Shaman, and as we get more gear and begin to perfect our healing strategy for the boss, the healers that know what they're doing will show up clear as day in the log, and the healers that don't know what they're doing are still going to parse gray. Now realize the significance of this log. This is our third kill of Magma. It's still pretty early in the raid tier, and we're practically 3 healing the boss because the priest and the shaman aren't very good at maximizing their healing. If myself and the Holy Pallies were healing as badly as the priest and the shaman were, we'd still be 6 healing this boss, I can promise you that. And every week that goes by, the good healers will prove to their raid leader that they can handle the healing checks of the boss. It will eventually get to the point where it no longer makes any logical sense to 5 heal. So the raid leader will make the decision to drop a second healer. And the raid leader knows we can handle 4 healing the boss because we've proven it to him every week by maximizing our healing. Do you see my point? If you don't maximize your healing, you will never prove to your raid leader that you are ready to drop healers. Even if maximizing your healing isn't necessary at all, you should still do it. And if your raid leader wants to continue playing it safe by constantly bringing 6 healers, then make it as safe as fucking possible. Give him what he wants. Make it so that the instant the health bars go down, you immediately top them back up, so that you show to your raid leader that you do not want to 6 heal, or else you're going to continue 6 healing. So when this guy says in his post, your guild doesn't need POH spam if you're 6 healing, that's bullshit. That's exactly what your guild needs. It's what your guild has needed this entire time. And this applies to every other healer as well. This is why maximizing your healing in general is important. Moving on from that, I have a little disagreement with what he says in the next section here. Atonement heals will almost always target the player who needs healing the most. That is fake news, my friends, and not for the reason that you think. The reason he's saying this statement is obvious. He's saying it because Atonement heals the lowest health player within 15 yards, which in his mind means that the player who needs the healing the most is getting it. And that would be true if it wasn't a 15-yard range. In MOP, they increased the range of Atonement to 40 yards. So if we were playing MOP right now, he would be correct. But in this expansion, not only is Atonement healing much weaker than it is in MOP, but the only players you're going to be healing are the melee DPS and the tanks. And here's the problem with that. The tanks don't need a consistent stream of healing on most boss fights. Just pressing Powered Shield for Rapture and using Penance and Holy Fire off cooldown is good enough in most cases. And on top of that, the melee DPS don't need any healing from you, the Disc Priest, because the melee DPS are literally the least likely to die on pretty much every boss fight, since the Holy Paladins and the Wrestle Shaman are literally spam healing them with really overpowered abilities. those abilities being Holy Radiance and Healing Rain. So if you're using the standard raid comp of double Holy Pally, 1 disc, 1 Arsham, 1 Orisa Druid, the ranged DPS and healers are literally the most likely to die on pretty much every boss because they're usually spread out, and the only healers that are good at healing spread out raid damage are priests and Wrestle Druids. So if you spam Atonement for the whole fight, you're going to have way too much healing going out onto the tank and melee DPS, and way too little healing going out onto the ranged. And this problem gets even worse if you play in a non-top tier guild. Look at the comment in the top left, because the Wrestle Druid in your raid is most likely going to be a shit noob. Most players who play Wrestle Druid don't know what the fuck they're doing. They're just spamming rejuve mindlessly on random people, watching their tree form, letting life bloom fall off left and right, not refreshing their mastery, and overhealing like crazy. Do you really want all those Wrestle Druid players to be solely responsible for healing all of the ranged DPS and healers because you, the Disc Priest, are just spamming Atonement the whole time and doing healing that is mostly irrelevant? The healing you're doing by spamming Atonement is not on the people who need it the most, it's on the people who need it the least. And the healing you're doing isn't even good because Atonement healing is mediocre at best. So when Wowhead says some stupid bullshit like this, you don't need to use Prayer of Healing, you can just let the Wrestle Shaman and Holy Priest heal instead. First off, I don't know why the fuck it mentions those two healers, it should say Wrestle Druid. And secondly, this is literally retarded advice to give to people. I promise you, everyone reading this guide is going to be playing in either a casual or semi-hardcore raiding guild. Telling those players to rely on their co-healers who 99 times out of 100 suck massive amounts of cock is literally the worst advice ever. Even if you're playing with a really good Wrestle Druid, it's risky as hell to put all the onus on them to heal their ranged and healers by themselves, so do not do this. Anyways, the last section of his comment about doing 10k DPS spamming Atonement is stupid, but I'm going to talk about that later on. Here's the next comment, and this one refers to 10-man, by the way, so don't think about 25-man during this next section of the video. Here we come to the lesson about why heal parsing is not the same as being the most helpful to your raid. Yes, you can stick bubbles on your raid with Aegis, and because bubbles eat damage before HP bars, you will soak up some of the damage that the Holy Pally was going to heal anyways, just jacking up their overhealing numbers for no real gain on the raid. Okay, so when he says soak up the damage that the Holy Pally was going to heal anyways, just remember that anytime anyone on the class Discord says something like this, they are assuming that your co-healer, in this case the Holy Pally, is good at the game. You never want to rely on your co-healers unless you're in a top guild. Now you can help out your co-healer. So like when I heal 10-man on my Disc Priest, I prioritize healing the ranged over the melee because Holy Pallys suck at healing the ranged who are usually spread out. But what I'm not going to do is rely on the Holy Pally to keep both the ranged and the melee alive while I just spam Atonement the whole time. Also, when he says just jacking up their overhealing numbers for almost no real gain on the raid, for some reason, the class Discord people keep saying this, I don't know why. If you soak up all the healing that there is to do, you're not causing the Holy Pally to overheal. You're causing them to sit on their mana. No Holy Pally is spamming heals on people who are full health and ooming themselves for no reason. That doesn't make any sense. Nor is it something you would ever want to play around, even if your Holy Pally is doing that. You could argue that forcing the Holy Pally to sit on their mana is bad, but there is a small benefit to it. And that benefit is, if any damage slips past the Disc Priest, the Holy Pally can heal it up with whatever spell they want, regardless of how inefficient that spell is, because they have all the mana that they've been sitting on at their disposal. Next, he says, it's better to use your smart healing, low overheal options that also deal damage to the boss and keep the people most likely to die alive while also letting the Holy Pally do the thing that they really shine at. When he says do the thing that they really shine at, what is that exactly? Healing the ranged? Because that's exactly what the Holy Pally is going to be doing. By spamming Atonement, you're literally healing the melee DPS and the tank. You are literally taking away efficient healing from the Holy Pally and forcing them to spam Divine Light on the ranged, and Divine Light is trash. It's possible that when this guy says, do the thing that Holy Pally shine at, he's assuming that you can just stack up the whole raid and have the Holy Pally spam Holy Radiance while the Disc Priest spams Atonement. Except most of the time, you can't even do that. On most bosses, the ranged are spread out. So what the fuck is this guy talking about? Next he says, healing is a team effort, and healing parses are in direct conflict with your co-healers for the most part, due to healing being a zero-sum game. And here comes the zero-sum game cope. The class Discord people love, absolutely love, to cope about healing being a zero-sum game. And all zero-sum game means is that any healing you do is lost healing for someone else. That's all it means. Now, the problem with saying healing is a zero-sum game is that it's only true if nobody can ever die to healable damage, which only applies to literally the easiest bosses in the raid tier that are also heavily on farm. So take Atramedes, for example. If Atramedes is on farm for your guild, then healing that boss will feel like a zero-sum game, because it's basically impossible for anyone to die. But that's it. This argument only applies to those kinds of bosses, and only when they're on farm. And technically this argument is still wrong, because you can just drop healers and healing the boss will no longer be a zero-sum game. So anytime you see someone say zero-sum game, just know that it's bullshit. This last point. As odd as it can sound to hear, more HPS does not mean you did your job better. Sort of like how DPS padding on ads that don't need to die might have the biggest number, but not be the helpful player to the raid. I think he worded that wrong, but you know, that's a lovely conclusion that he came to. Somehow I'm not convinced that this conclusion is accurate, considering all of his arguments up to this point have been completely flawed. Even his last point here is flawed, where he's comparing heal parsing to DPS padding on ads. These two things are not comparable, because padding on ads accomplishes nothing of value. Parsing as a healer literally means you're maximizing your healing, which tends to be really good for keeping the raid alive, and that is valuable. So this comparison doesn't make any sense at all. Okay, here's the next comment. I'm just going to go through point by point since this is a long post. Mastery does look good on logs and the healing meter, but in practice does not significantly help your healing team keep people alive. Any healing Divine Aegis does will come at the expense of healing from the rest of your healing team. Okay, first off, I don't know why he's talking about Mastery and Divine Aegis. You reforge Mastery if you want to do the pre-powered shielding playstyle. You don't reforge Mastery if you're just spamming Prayer of Healing. You reforge Crit for that. So that doesn't make any sense. But on top of that, all healing you do comes at the expense of the rest of your healing team, not just Divine Aegis. So I don't see how this is an argument against Mastery or an absorb-based playstyle. Next he says, absorbs show up so well on meters and logs because they happen before any other healer can heal the damage. But the only time that absorb healing is actually effective is if the absorb allowed a player to live through a hit that would have otherwise killed them. This is also untrue. There are 3 ways in which healing can be considered effective. The first is to keep up with the healing check boss. The second is to minimize the risk of people dying. And the third is to directly save people's lives. The reason why absorbs are so effective is because they can do all 3 of these things extremely well. Pretty much every other healing spell in the game can only do those first 2 things decently well, but not as well as absorbs can, because absorbs don't overheal, and you can start applying them before the damage even starts happening, like he said. Also, most heals in the game are not specifically designed for saving lives, but absorbs are especially good at it because they give you more health points, essentially. So if you take a big hit, but you had an absorb on you before you took it, well, you're less likely to die. So absorbs are not only effective for saving lives, like this person is suggesting, they're good for the other 2 things as well. The relative power of healers to fill HP bars is lower than it was in Wrath, that's true. And additionally, it generally takes longer for unhealed damage to kill players outside of failed mechanics. That's also true. This makes the relatively little percentage of an HP bar Divine Aegis covers less valuable, as Divine Aegis shields are very rarely big enough to mean the difference between a dead player or not. That last part is not true. The relatively little percentage of an HP bar that Divine Aegis covers is not less valuable, because every other heal that you have, and every other class has in Kata, also heals for less relative to the size of the health pool. Also, the bosses in Kata deal damage to you much slower, and in most cases in less amounts than they did in Wrath, to account for the fact that you heal for less. So Divine Aegis is equally as valuable as it was in Wrath. In fact, it's actually more valuable because nobody even used Divine Aegis in Wrath of Lich King. They just spammed Powered Shield. Also, saying Divine Aegis shields aren't big enough to save people's lives isn't a good argument, because not every spell is or has to be designed to save people's lives. There are other ways in which your heals can be effective besides just saving a person's life, but I already explained that before. Next he says, in general, the Divine Aegis Absorb will just be healing that the Holy Pally or Rust Druid will now do as overhealing on their next cast at the target. More overhealing propaganda. Love it. A far better approach is lean into the niche that Disc has to be the versatile healer that can AoE with Prayer of Healing when required, tank heal so that the Pallies and Druids don't have to with Penance and Powered Shield, and default to the one thing that Disc can do that the other healers cannot. Contribute to killing the boss faster while healing through Atonement. Okay, here's the juicy part. Out of everything he said in this post, this is the part that I actually want to respond to because I think it's important for people to hear. So he mentions that Disc has a niche that the other healers don't have, and the implication there is that this niche is important to play into. Except that's not the way that you should think about the game. Just because you have a niche doesn't automatically mean that playing into your niche is the best thing to do. For example, Disc has the pre-shielding niche. But just because you have that niche doesn't automatically mean the best thing to do is spam Powered Shield preemptively. In order to figure out what the best thing to do is, you need to have actual reasons for why what you're doing is the best thing to do. Just saying it's your niche is not a reason. The other stuff he said is just bad advice. So he mentioned Prayer of Healing when required. The problem with that, as I've alluded to before, is that you're never going to know when the exact right time to Prayer of Healing is because you can't see the fucking future. You can't know for sure if people are going to do the mechanics properly unless you're in a top guild, like I've already said many times. So it's better to just play it safe and Prayer of Healing as much as possible so that if people do make mistakes, their health bar will be as high as possible going into making that mistake. Next he says, tank heal so that the Pallies and Druids don't have to with Penance and Powered Shield. This part is partially correct because Powered Shield and Penance are good for tank healing and you should be healing the tanks with those. But I don't know why he's mentioning Druid here, since Druid does a fuck ton of consistent tank healing throughout the fight, and all of it is efficient. So you would never want to do so much tank healing that the rest of Druid can't heal the tank anymore, because that would be inefficient. There's also another healer that does really good and efficient tank healing, and that is Resto Shaman. They have Earth Shield and Riptide on the tank for the whole fight, which is good in its own right, but they also have a greater healing wave, which is an extremely fast cast if you're geared for haste, which you should be. And it heals for more on players that have Earth Shield because of this talent. Greater healing wave already has a lot of use cases for Resto Shaman, but it's especially useful on the tank, which means Resto Shamans are literally the best emergency tank healers in the game, because all you have to do is wait for the tank to drop below 50% health, then cast your greater healing wave, and the tank will literally never die. Also, the Resto Shaman's parse will literally be better if they do that. So when these people on the class discords believe that they're providing a huge benefit to the raid by spamming tank healing with Atonement, just realize that it's all a lie. Now, if your guild is struggling with tank healing, then yeah, you can do it. Cho'Gall and Helphas are bosses where tank healing can be an issue, so spamming Atonement a lot of the time is the right thing to do. But for most bosses, you really don't have to take an active role in tank healing. You can literally just Penance and Holy Fire off cooldown and Powered Shield for Rapture, and the tank will be fine. Lastly, he says, default to the one thing that Disc can do that the other healers cannot. Contribute to killing the boss faster while healing through Atonement. Well, you could do that. If you only spam Atonement and do nothing else, you'll probably do around 10k DPS and kill the boss around 5 seconds faster on 25 men, assuming nobody dies. If you do a mix of Atonement and Prayer of Healing, you'll kill the boss around 3 seconds faster. If that really matters to you, then go ahead. But just know that if you let people die because you were spamming Atonement mindlessly for the whole fight and you have to res people once the boss is over, the benefit that you've been providing by spamming Atonement is gone. Even worse, if the raid wipes a single time because you were spamming Atonement and you could have saved them by just healing properly, all those little 3-second, 5-second optimizations from spamming atonement for the entire raid are completely wiped out because you let the raid wipe a single time, just so you know. And don't think that blaming other people for the wipe is going to justify spamming atonement, because I know healers love to do that. They love to blame people's deaths on them taking unnecessary damage. But the thing is, your job as a healer is to keep people alive to the best of your ability. You're not only supposed to heal the unavoidable damage. That's what bad healers do. Anyways, the last thing he says is, more mastery will not make Divine Aegis good enough to save people, but more haste and crit, after having enough spirit to keep casting, will help you better fulfill your role on the healing team. If by fulfilling your role on the raid team, he means adding much more risk, forcing your guilds to bring an extra healer to compensate for your lack of healing, and making the boss die 5 seconds faster with your 6 healer raid comp, then yeah, he's right. You are fulfilling your role. If that's the role you want to fulfill, then go right ahead. Also, this next part here about having enough spirit is fake news. This is some old shit that people used to say in original kata, but it's not true. The point where you stop getting spirit is when it's literally impossible to go while maximizing your healing on the most healing intensive boss in the raid tier. Al'Akir is that boss in this raid tier. So the point where you would stop getting spirit is when you can literally pre-powered shield all the damage in phases 1 and 3, while also spamming Prayer of Healing as much as possible throughout the entire fight. Obviously, our gear is nowhere near that point, so the optimal thing to do is to just get as much spirit as possible. Next comment. From my experience, whenever someone dies during progress, ask yourself, could you have avoided the death, and how? Did anyone but the player have avoided the death? Was it your responsibility or another healer's? If you do not know which healer was responsible, talk to the other healers and do assignments. Helps a lot more than looking at healing numbers or rotations. Healing meters are irrelevant. Okay, so here's another thing that I see people do on forums and class discords. They do this, it's kind of like a Jedi mind trick. Basically how it works is they have a conclusion that they're trying to push, which in this case is healing meters are irrelevant. And the way that they get to that conclusion is by saying a whole bunch of stuff that is actually true, which makes you think that their conclusion is also true, until you realize that their conclusion isn't actually related to all the good shit that they were saying. That's the mistake this person made. So let's read through this again. Whenever someone dies during progress, ask yourself, could you have avoided the death and how? I assume he means could you have prevented the death and how, which is definitely a good thing to think about when someone dies. Could anyone but that player have prevented the death? That's also a good thing to ask yourself. Was it your responsibility or another healer's? Technically, most of the time, it's every healer's responsibility when someone dies to healable damage, so I'm not sure I agree with that one, but it's okay. If you do not know which healer was responsible, talk to the other healers and do assignments. Hey, that's probably a good idea. Helps a lot more than looking at healing numbers or rotations. Yeah, it's true. When someone dies, it does help to think about these things instead of looking at healing numbers most of the time. Healing meters are irrelevant. No. Wrong. You see what he did there? He said a whole bunch of good shit up to that point, but that's where he loses me, because everything he said has very little to do with healing meters. The stuff that he was talking about has to do with saving individual players' lives during an encounter, which is only one aspect of healing, like I said before. And that particular aspect of healing has very minimal impact on healing meters compared to the other two aspects of healing. Most of your globals as a healer are going to be spent doing these two things, and these two things are where the bulk of your overall healing is coming from. The saving lives part only happens when someone is in critical danger and you need to throw out a powered shield or a flash shield to save them. But here's the thing. If you do a really good job at these two things, that'll minimize the amount of time that people end up in a situation where you need to save them. So if you look at it from that perspective, you'll see that healing meters are in fact relevant, but it's typically not the thing you'll want to look at when it comes to figuring out why an individual player died and what could have been done to save them. Next comment. The top disc healers are the discs in top guilds, not the discs at the top of Warcraft logs for HPS. People should know this about healers in a game this old. Also, disc is emphatically the worst healer on Al'Akir because atonement doesn't work well, you're the worst raid healer in phase 2, and phase 3 is high movement with a high healing requirement. In a perfect world, you just go holy every time until your raid outgeared the heal check enough to do it comfortably as disc. Here's another typical comment from the class discords, a very typical comment. All the people on the class discords absolutely love to suck off healers in top guilds. Oh god, they're so fucking good. I wish I was as good as them. First off, a distinction needs to be made. What flavor of top guild are you talking about? Are you talking about speedrunning guilds? Or are you talking about guilds that just clear the raid in the first week? Because the top guilds that don't speedrun are going to be heavily parse focused and therefore trying to aggressively drop healers so that the boss dies faster, which means that in those guilds, both the healers and the DPS will parse well and your statement would be incorrect. Somehow I don't think that's the kind of guild this person is sucking off. Surely he's talking about healers in speedrunning guilds, except the problem with sucking off those healers is that you really don't need to do that much healing in speedrunning guilds. Now, I'm not an expert on speedrunning by any means, considering I've never done it or would want to do it, but from what I can tell, these kinds of guilds are well practiced on the beta and the PTR. They have a really good comp. They have all the raid cooldowns perfectly set up for every high damage event. They have a high concentration of good players, which means everyone in the raid is going to be good at avoiding damage. And all their healers are good, which means as a healer, you can perfectly rely on your co-healers to heal the people that they're supposed to be healing. And the end result of all that is, you really don't have to do that much as a healer. You kind of just heal through the damage that your class is good at healing, use cooldowns to get through the hard parts, and that's about it. There's very little healing gameplay dedicated to minimizing risk or saving people from the brink of death after they make a mistake, or managing your mana perfectly so that you go exactly when the boss dies. And the main reason for that is because the goal is to go fast, but also because those guilds plan things out so meticulously and they're so well practiced and the players are so good at keeping themselves alive that you really don't have to go above and beyond to maximize your healing. Funnily enough, the most impressive thing about speedrunning guilds isn't how good the healers are at healing or how good the DPSers are at DPSing. There are tons of players in the world who are just as good at DPSing and healing as they are. The impressive parts are the elaborate strategies that they come up with to speed through the raid and the bosses faster, and the execution of those strategies in a high pressure, high stress environment. That's the impressive part. So it doesn't make any sense for the class Discord people to suck off the healers in those guilds as much as they do. You can suck them off for many things because those players are very good, and the time investment and dedication they have towards this dead virgin game is really admirable. But their healing gameplay isn't one of the things that you should be sucking them off for. And you certainly shouldn't be telling healers in semi-hardcore and casual raiding guilds to play the same way that those healers play, because you're hardly even playing the same game. The difference in how healers experience the game in top guilds compared to how healers experience the game in regular raiding guilds is night and day. It's not even comparable. If you try to play the way that those healers in speedrunning guilds play in any normal raiding guild, you will literally wipe over and over again. It is not the optimal way to play for the vast majority of players in the world. I assume that the healing community just kind of blindly believes that copying what the top guilds are doing is a good idea, because for DPSers, it is a good thing to do. The main difference between maximizing your DPS in good guilds compared to lower level guilds is that good guilds tend to do more parse focused strategies. But other than that, it's pretty much the same. Tanking is probably a little bit different in lower level guilds compared to top level, because at top level you can justify changing your playstyle and gearing to maximize damage a lot more than you'd be able to justify it at lower level. Now, in regards to the second part of his comment about Disc being bad on Alakir, I just completely disagree. I'm of the opinion that every healer is a god on Alakir. But the reason why Disc is so good is because Power, Shield, and Penance are really good for saving lives in phases 1 and 3. Prayer of Healing and Penance are really good for phase 2. And Pain Suppression and Barrier are just good in general. Holy Priest might do more raw AoE healing throughput than Disc does, but Disc has more mana to work with, so it all kind of evens out in the end. Switching to Holy Priest on Alakir isn't really going to help as much as this guy believes that it would. Next comment. This one is just some more echo chamber shit. You know how it goes. Trog the person who disagrees with you, blame them, get them to leave the Discord, blah blah blah. There is one thing I do want to respond to though. If you have read one Trog post saying to spam POH, you have read them all. They are all the same. They start saying the fact is dumb and atonement is dumb and HPS is king. All the reasonable people tell them that there is a place for atonement and a place for POH. And it turns out you have more than one button, and not every group is built in the exact same way. Then they argue for an hour over nothing, and the sun sets, and then the sun rises, and it happens again. Okay, the part where he says all reasonable people tell them there's a place for atonement and a place for POH. That's funny. I must be a reasonable person then, considering I've never told anybody that they should never use atonement. I doubt anybody else has either. I tell people that they should use Prayer of Healing way more than atonement because it does more healing, and it does more healing on the people who really need it, which are going to be the range DPS most of the time. You should still heal with atonement, mainly by casting Holy Fire off cooldown, but it shouldn't be the focus of your gameplay unless you play in a speedrunning guild or a top 10-man raiding guild that has all the content on farm. Next up, we've got this guy who likes to compare my guild to his because he thinks that means something. Obviously, it's pretty retarded to insinuate that you're better than someone else because of the guild that you play in, considering that individual players do not have an enormous impact over the guild's progress unless that person is the raid leader and the recruiter for the guild. Healers do have a decent impact over the guild's success, but just not as much as this guy seems to believe with his comments here. He says, my healing plus pally healing plus random passive healing equals raid damage taken. And he's talking about 10 men here. And then he says, in Mac Daddy's raid, it's his healing plus pally healing plus random passive healing equals raid damage taken. And my DPS is twice his, and we have better progress in execution. And I bet if he and I swapped raids, it would look almost exactly the same. How do you even motivate his style? Well, that's a cute way of framing everything if you're trying to be biased towards yourself, which is certainly his goal. Notice that he mentions the benefit of his playstyle when he says his DPS is double what mine is. But he didn't mention what the benefit of my playstyle is, probably because he doesn't even know what it is. But the benefit of my playstyle is exactly what I've been saying for this entire video. It's safer. And that is exactly why his next statement here is wrong, where he says, and I bet if he and I swapped raids, it would look almost exactly the same. Yeah, it would look almost exactly the same, except what would happen is you would wipe more if you were in my guild because you're used to doing the bare minimum amount of healing while relying on the rest of your raid team as much as possible, which, as I've explained before, doesn't really work when you're playing in an average level raiding guild. And I wouldn't wipe more if I was in your guild. We would just kill the bosses a little bit slower. In fact, we'd probably wipe a little bit less. But that's not the only thing I want to mention. I want to talk a little bit about 10-man healing versus 25-man. So in 10-man, your DPS as a healer has more weight. So on 25-man, you might be able to make the boss die like 5 seconds faster if you spam atonement the whole time. Whereas on 10-man, you'll be able to make the boss die maybe 8 or 9 seconds faster. And this sounds good. Like, it sounds like a good argument to spam damage as a disc priest, but this argument also goes both ways. Your DPS might have more weight, but your healing also has more weight in 10-man, to the point where a single good healer can keep the raid alive through a lot of unnecessary damage. In fact, if you have 2 good healers in 10-man, the raid is basically unkillable outside of raid wipe mechanics. So when this guy says, how do you even motivate his style? There's your motivation right there, to make the raid pretty much unkillable. And it's more fun as well, because DPSing as a healer isn't fun at all, in my opinion. To be honest with you, with how much this guy pushes DPSing as a disc priest, I'm not even convinced that he even enjoys healing. The only enjoyment this guy must get is spending all fucking day in the class Discord just circle jerking with everyone. Because my god, is it ever just a big suckfest in there. I'm surprised any of those guys can even speak at this point with all those fucking loads swirling around in their mouths. Next comment. Here we've got a debate tactic that I absolutely hate, and that is making up a scenario that is impossible and believing that it helps your argument. Here's the first one. The optimal DPS is infinite. The optimal HPS is 0. If you could do 10 billion DPS in 0.1 seconds, you would. And if you could avoid spending any time dedicated to doing healing, you would. So that's what you strive for. Well, he literally could have just said that doing more damage is good and taking damage is bad. Except everyone already knows that. Thank you for stating the obvious. Now, what's his point? Because it seems like he's making my argument for me. If your goal is to get to 0 HPS and 10 billion DPS, the fastest way to get there is not by doing damage as a disc priest. It's by dropping healers so that you can get more DPS in the raid. And eventually you'll drop all your healers and you'll be that much closer to 10 billion DPS and 0 HPS. Thank you for making my argument for me. Here's the next impossible scenario. But fundamentally, DPS doing more damage makes every DPS parse better. Like if you could magically add in an 11th or 26th person to the raid as a DPS, that would make every DPS parse better because the boss dies faster. That's why DPS truly isn't zero sum the way HPS is. You know, that's cool and all, except you don't have to magically add in an 11th or 26th person into the raid. You can just normally add them in and get rid of a healer in the process. That's why both DPSing and healing aren't truly zero sum. Now, here's something that people do on the forums and class discords that I absolutely hate. And a lot of you watching this video are guilty of doing this at one point or another because I've seen it like 1,000 times. This is what they do. They quote something out of context, react to it in a really cringe, over the top way, and then they don't explain why it's wrong. Please do not do this. This is a really stupid thing to do. Here's what they said. This guy quotes a line from my recent video that I made where I was saying, speaking of Smite, you'll have a difficult time using this ability. Take Magma, for example. Conveniently, he doesn't explain why that statement is wrong. And he also doesn't include my justification for saying that, which came immediately after in the video. Bob 50,000 pipes up with his stupid reaction to the out-of-context quote. Snickles continues to talk shit without providing any reason for why anything I said was wrong. Bob 50,000 then acts surprised that my guild isn't doing the mechanics of the boss perfectly. Welcome to like 95% of the raiding guilds in the world. Alpha Star decides to chime in and start making things up. Who the fuck knows what this guy is saying? And this guy responds with, Jesus Christ, yet again, not stating why anything I said was wrong. I swear to God, when I used to read the forums, I saw people do this shit all the fucking time. And it's total brain rot. But that's what these kinds of people do. And that's why I stopped going to the forums, because nobody on there wants to have proper discussions about anything. Hell, in my opinion, forums and the class discords aren't even good platforms to have proper discussions about anything, which is why I'd never want to go on there to talk about anything. Anyways, if you've managed to reach this point in the video, congratulations for making it this far. Now what I'm going to do is tell you the exact way, the 100% most optimal way that I believe most players in the world are supposed to be playing Disc Priest. But keep one thing in mind before I tell you this. It's really not that important to play 100% perfectly or to strive for that. Most guilds aren't going to notice a difference between you playing 90% perfectly versus 100% perfectly. In my opinion, your goal shouldn't even be to play 100% perfectly. It should be to get yourself to a place where you're happy with your healing output and happy with how you're playing. That's it. That's all you gotta do, and hopefully you'll have a fun time doing it. But regardless of that, I will tell you what I believe is the best way to heal for most players, and the way that I'm going to explain it is by talking about the types of damage that you're going to be healing. There are 3 types of damage that are relevant to healers. Damage that can kill you, but doesn't instantly one-shot you. Damage that hits you hard, but won't kill you if you're at full health. And damage that is completely irrelevant. And this kind of goes in tandem with what I said before about your healing being effective in 3 ways. This is just another way of saying exactly the same thing, so hopefully that doesn't confuse anyone. Now I'm going to give examples for each. So examples of abilities that kill you outright but don't instantly one-shot you are Acquiring Target on Omnitron, Lightning Strike on Alakir. Acid Rain on Alakir counts as well, because if you go too fast or fail to meet the healing check, you just die. Other examples are the lightning damage in Phase 3 of Ascending Council, and Acid Nova on Maloriak. As for abilities that hit you hard but don't outright kill you, if you're at full health, well, that applies to most abilities. So Magma's Lava Spew and Lava Spit, Sinestra's Flame Breath and Cutters, not the line going through the cutters, but the purple orbs, you can get nicked by those if you're close enough and you won't die. Lightning Conductor and Shadow Conductor on Omnitron, Crackle and the Purple Fire on Nefarian, Chill Gulls and Powered Shadows and Shadow Crashes, and the Black Puddles on Maloriak, etc. And lastly, examples of abilities that do completely irrelevant damage are Poison Cloud on Omnitron, the Sonar Discs on Atromedes I don't believe do that much damage at all, parts of the fight where there isn't much happening, like on Omnitron Defense System when only one robot is active, that applies here. And also downtime applies. So periods of the fight where only the tank is taking damage and the damage is non-lethal. Now the first type of damage is pretty cut and dry as to how you should heal it. Every healer should try their best to maximize their healing on the types of damage that can kill you outright. As far as the irrelevant damage, the optimal thing to do is to spam damage as a Disc Priest, unless you're really trying to conserve mana, in which case you should just Penance and Holy Fire off CD to heal the tank, use Power Shield for Rapture, use Smite only for Evangelism stacks, and then after you've done that, just kind of stand there. Now the main thing I want to talk about is the type of damage that hits you hard, but doesn't kill you outright. Because this is the part where I believe the community en masse doesn't really know what the optimal thing to do is. And the answer to that goes back to what I've been saying for this entire video. It depends on what kind of guild you're in and what your goals are. If you want to maximize the safety of the raid, then maximizing healing for this type of damage is the best thing to do most of the time. There are certain times where it's not, so like Maloriak and Nefarian come to mind, where the optimal thing to do can be to heal the tank instead of healing the raid after a big hit of raid damage happens. This is a decision that you have to make in the moment. Sometimes the tanks won't be in danger, sometimes they will. You have to decide what to do when the situation arises. But most of the time, the safest thing to do is to maximize your healing. And even if you deviate from the playstyle of maximizing your healing here and there, whether it's to save someone's life with a flash heal, or to do a little bit of extra healing on the tanks, it's really not going to affect your parse that much, especially once you get a bunch of raid gear. So that's how you would maximize safety. Now, if your goal is to maximize overall raid DPS, then the best thing to do is also to maximize your healing. Because if you're good at maximizing your healing, then your guild can drop healers and the overall raid DPS will be maximized. The middle ground approach is to maximize your damage as a Disc Priest. And I would only really recommend doing this in speedrunning guilds or in really good 10-man guilds, since it's harder to drop healers in 10-man. So if I were to put a number on it, I would say that the most optimal way to play a Disc Priest for the vast majority of healers in the world is to maximize your healing around 90 to 99% of the time, depending on the boss. There are some bosses where maximizing your healing is bad, so for example, you don't want to maximize your healing on really weird bosses like Chimera or Conclave of Wind, potentially depending on what platform you're on, and Nefarian as well, if you've been assigned to heal the kiting tank. But every other boss, you should. And if you look at my logs, that's basically what you'll see. I don't even try to maximize my healing on the bosses that I don't consider to be legitimate for healing parses. And to be honest, if you look at someone's logs and their best parses are on the non-legitimate bosses, then that's how you know that they fucking suck. For example, the Holy Pally player in my guild thinks he's so good at the game, despite just being a brain-dead Holy Paladin player. Well, his logs seem to indicate that he's not as good as he thinks he is because his best parses are on fucking Chimeron and Nefarian. Go figure. This kid is fucking trash. Okay, he's also a redneck, MAGA, hillbilly looking motherfucker as well. So, talk about down bad. Anyways, let's switch the screen back to my superior logs here. Now, I want you guys to keep in mind that the way that I play isn't the 100% most optimal way of playing. I could squeeze in some damage here and there. However, the way that I play is certainly a lot closer to being 100% optimal than what the class Discord people are telling you to do. Because the class Discords are giving you advice that only applies to healers and speedrunning guilds, and they don't even realize that they're doing it. The advice that I'm giving you is relevant to pretty much every type of raiding guild, and that is why I believe healer class Discords are harmful. Thank you for watching my video. Bye-bye.